we have entered into a very interesting section of the course where we are going to start tackling asynchronous event handling with Redux. Now, explaining the concepts is going to seem way more complicated than it actually is, but I'm going to definitely make this easy for you while we build out and convert our existing code to leverage Redux more in handling these async GET requests that we've got right here, making this API call to get the data, which we then store in our state. So as we mentioned in the last lesson, our shop page right now is the only part of the application that is actually able to fetch this collection information. But if we had other parts of the application that needed to leverage this code, we would have to rewrite it or move it out somehow. But the problem is that our loading state is also attached to this collection, right? Inside of this component did mount code. We want to be able to abstract all of this into its own reusable part of the code. Now, the great thing is that as far as the state goes, we can probably actually already imagine that we should put this on a Redux state. The other thing, however, is that if our Redux was actually able to handle asynchronous event handling, we could actually move all of this asynchronous code into an action and then have it dispatch accordingly. Now, I'm going to show you the structure of how we should write that code using Redux and a new library that allows us to handle asynchronous event handling and firing multiple actions called Redux Thunk. Now, before I dive into writing that code and explaining what thunks are, let's include the library first. Once thunk is inside of our library, we just need to include it into our store. Now, all thunk is it's a piece of middleware that allows us to fire functions. That's all it is. I'm going to actually show you what it looks like once we actually bring it in. So I'm going to import thunk inside of my store.js from Redux Thunk, and then put it in the middlewares array. And that's all we need as far as setup goes. To actually start using it, we need to start reconfiguring our shop reducer, writing new shop actions, and modifying our code to be ready for our new Redux code. So let me write the code first before I start diving too deep into it, because this is one of those things where you kind of have to see it all first before it starts to really click. But I'm definitely going to explain some key concepts along the way. Now, the first thing we'll need to do is modify our types. Before, we had a simple update collections action call because we were handling all the asynchronous activity here. Instead, what we're going to do now is we are actually going to set multiple states that our shop actions could be in as far as fetching the asynchronous data goes. Now, what I mean by this is that we're actually going to have a fetch collections start call, which exactly as you imagine is what tells Redux we're starting to fetch the data. So this is actually before any data gets fetched. This is when the first API call to our Firestore begins. It's just the start. And then we're going to have a fetch collections success call, which is where it comes back from us with a successful API request, and hopefully the data that we need is also come back as well. And we need an action for that as well. And then we're going to have a fetch collections failure call. So this is pretty much what happens if, for example, our server is down, our internet connection is poor, we don't have the proper credentials, whatever it is that makes an API call fail, we want to handle that in its own action as well. Now, in our shop reducer, we now have to update not only our initial state, but also our reducer. So all we're going to add to this is an isFetching property with a Boolean value. So by default, we'll set it to false. And all this tells anyone looking at this value is whether or not we're fetching the data for our collections property. So prior, we had the loading value here inside of our shop page because our component was the one that was doing the API call. Now we're going to move it into Redux. So our reducer needs to be aware, or at least our reducer needs to tell anyone looking into it whether or not data is being fetched or successfully fetched. All this is indicating is that there's a state where our application is fetching data related to the shop reducer. Again, this will make more sense once we write this out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to replace this update collections call after we write the other ones first. So we're going to now need a new case for shop action types.fetch collection start. And all this does is it indicates again to our reducer, right, that where is fetching is going to be true. And that's all it is. Next will be our shop action types.fetch collections success, which is going to replace the code that we had here. So we can just get rid of this. And we're going to set is fetching to false, as well as updating our collections with our payload. If you can understand, we're pretty much saying once our API is successful, right, we're going to now update our collections, right, with our payload. We're also going to tell our reducer that it's no longer fetching. Now, this will also be the case when our action types.fetch collections failure comes through, because technically it's not fetching anymore either. So we're just going to say .state, right? Is fetching is false because it is false. It's already finished the API request, but what we're going to do is we want to do something with our error. Now, we can either store the entire error object ourselves, or we can store the error message. For our case, let's just store the error message. So we're just going to add a new thing called error message, and we're going to make it an empty string by default, or at least undefined. And now what we'll do is we'll just say that error message is going to go to action.payload. So our payload that we got to make sure we're passing through is the error message string. So now that we have our reducers, we have to think about our actions. And in order for us to write our actions, this is where we're going to leverage thunks. All thunks are is a action creator that returns a function that gets the dispatch, very similar to the map dispatch to props. Instead of creating an action that returns an action, right? That's all we're doing. We're writing a function that returns an action, right? An action object. We're going to write a function that returns a function that gets dispatch in it, so that whenever dispatch is called, it'll fire multiple actions. I know it sounds confusing, but let's write it out. I promise it'll make sense once we write it out. First, what we're going to do is we're going to change this update collections to fetch collections start. And this is going to be our fetch collections start call with no payload. Because all this action does is it switches our reducer's is fetching state. That's all it does. Then what we're going to do is we're going to make a new const called fetch collections start async. This is going to be the actual function that we pass into our components to begin this process. And I'll show you why we name it this way after. So again, all we're doing is we are returning a function, right? And inside of this function, we are going to return that function I told you that gets a dispatch. Now, what we want to do inside of this function is we want to do all of the code that we had in our shop component, all this asynchronous stuff. In fact, we're just going to copy this over, paste it in, and bring in all of these other things that we need, except for this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to import all those dependencies that we had in our shop. And we are going to bring in the Firestore, as well as our convert collection snapshot to map. And here, we're pretty much doing exactly the same thing, right, that we had before. Except what we're going to do is that once this starts, we are going to actually dispatch our fetch collections start call. So what we're doing is we're dispatching the moment this function gets called, right? Our fetch collection start async gets called. The moment we call that function, Redux is going to then go through this function. It's going to instantiate this function the moment we call this in our application code. What's going to happen is it's going to create the collection ref, and then it's going to dispatch the action fetch collection start, which will switch our reducer state is fetching to true. And then it's going to begin this asynchronous request. It's going to go out, fetch the code, right, from our backend. It's going to come back. We're going to build our collection map. And then we are going to make a fetch collections success call. And this is where we're going to get our collections map and return what we had, very similar to our earlier update collections action. Except this time it's going to be fetch collection success. And as we remember in our reducer, this is where we put in the payload, right, of our collections. So just like we had before, we're just going to set our collections map. And this is where we are going to now dispatch this method. Right here. There's no longer any need for set state. And that is all it is. The moment that this code comes in, we are going to dispatch this success once this asynchronous request resolves. As far as our error handling goes, as we know, we can throw a .catch or we get our error. And as you can expect, we're going to now dispatch the error call that our reducer is expecting, right? Our fetch collections failure. And as we remember, that is expecting the error message. So we are going to export const fetch collections failure. And this is going to be our error message. And here we're going to return type of shop action types dot fetch collections failure, where the payload goes to our error message. And in order for us to use this, we just got to make sure to pass through into our error creator the error dot message. And now if we save, we now have this asynchronous action creator. This is all a thunk is. It's just a function that returns a function that gets access to dispatch, so that we can dispatch multiple actions and handle asynchronous code inside of it. We've also moved our isLoading state into the shop reducer. So now anything related to this asynchronous code is handled by Redux inside of a reusable action now. It's no longer tied to our shop component, but we will need it inside of our shop component. So what we'll do is we'll remove all this code that we don't need anymore. And I'll show you what we'll do to bring it in. So we don't need this either, because now it's all getting handled by our reducer. So now instead of this, we're going to bring in our fetch collection start async method. And then we're also going to bring in create structured selector, because we know we're going to want to select certain values off of our state. Structured selector from reselect. What else we know we need to do is actually create the selector that will pull in that is fetching property. So we're going to go to our shop selectors, and we're just going to make a new selector called export const select is collection fetching. And this is going to be our create selector call, where we pass in select shop, right? Because we want the shop object. And then off it, we're just going to return shop.isFetching. That's all it is. We're now going to bring this into our selectors. Shop selectors. And now we need to write our map state to props. So now that we know that we don't have this anymore, we're just going to clear this out first. And what we're going to do is we're going to const map state to props, which is equal to create structured selector, where is fetching is going to point to our select is collection fetching, right? In fact, we'll call it is collection fetching to be more explicit. And then in our map dispatch to props, we now need our fetch collection start async method. So here, what we're going to call is a function that dispatches our fetch collection start async method. We're going to pass our map state to props into our connect function as well. And now we need both of these from our props to replace these values. So now, instead of pulling in loading from the state that we had before, we're going to pull in is collection fetching from our props because it comes in as a props. And we're going to pass this into our is loading calls. Exact same way, except the true false is now on a reducer. Next, in our fetch collection start async, we got to make sure to call it in our component did mount. So let's destructure it off of our props. And then we're just going to call it the moment component mounts. Now, if we save and we go back to our application, we'll see that our code works the exact same way that we expected it to. The only difference now is that we have these new methods that kickstart once this component mounts. A fetch collection start method gets called. And what it does is that before, when we look at our shop, right, before the action fired, we see we have our initial state. Is fetching is false. No error message, collections is null. Our method fires, and suddenly now our is fetching is true, which is what caused our spinner to appear. The moment it came back, right, with the correct API request inside of our action, right, the moment this comes back, we then dispatch our new fetch collection success. And that's what this action is right here, fetch collection success. Once fetch collection success comes in, the payload is of our objects. We go through the appropriate transforms, so that's why our payload looks like the final object that it needs to be. And then it updates our shop reducer accordingly. And with that, our components and our code work the same way that they did before, but now we've moved our code out into a Redux handled asynchronous event process. And this pattern is a very, very common pattern in Redux, especially for asynchronous event handling when it comes to having components that depend on external APIs to provide it with the data. Now, I know that what I explained might seem very confusing. This idea of like thunks and like passing in functions. If you got it, amazing. If you didn't, that's perfectly fine. We're gonna have to go through it again and again anyways, because practice makes perfect. So watch this video a couple times, right? Read Redux thunks, get repository. The more you look at it, the more it makes sense. But all it is just that we now are able to return this function, which can now dispatch multiple actions, which in turn allows us to now handle asynchronous activity inside of an action instead of our component. So if we have multiple components that possibly need this shop data, right, they can just fire the action, and then all the other components don't even have to worry because the data will now be stored inside of our reducer, and we don't have to rewrite that code. Now, I know, guys, that was a really long video, but thank you for sticking through to it, because this is a very, very important thing to look at. This pattern is incredibly, incredibly common to see, especially in terms of how these actions influence the state of how we store this is fetching state on our reducer. You might see it named is loading or something else, but this start success failure pattern is everywhere in React Redux web development. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to tackle a new pattern with using higher order components, but in such a way that it allows us to extrapolate our with spinner modified components a level higher. So I'll see you in the next lesson.